They weighed him like grain, but priced him like meat. They weighed him like grain, but priced him like meat. 37 Roman pounds of muscle, bone, and silence. His value etched in wax tablets alongside amphorae of oil and jugs of wine. On the auction block, the auctioneer's voice rang through the forum like a drumbeat, describing his body the way a farmer would assess cattle. Strong shoulders, no visible scars, teeth intact. Estimated age 16. No one had asked his name. Names were for men. This was merchandise. Above the slave market, the awnings filtered morning sun into sharp, angular shadows that sliced across blank faces. The faces of those who had learned never to look a buyer in the eye. The air was choked with the scent of sweat, olive oil, old blood, and fear, so potent it slipped past incense and prayers. Chains clinked faintly with every munta, symphony of captivity. Marcus Crassus Aquila stood at a distance, arms crossed. His eye, sharpened by years of commerce in flesh, calculated the boy's frame. Likely Germanic, broad chest, long limbs, dense bones, a perfect mold for the arena. His Lannister ran calloused fingers across the boy's arms, checking for old breaks, assessing flexibility. This wasn't cruelty. This was inventory. The bidding started at 50 denarii. It rose like the sun, steadily, inexorably. A Thracian trainer raised his hand. A Syrian merchant offered more, but Aquila had deeper pockets and keener vision. He wasn't just buying a boy, he was buying a future spectacle. At 120 denarii, the gavel fell. The scribe dipped his stylus into ink. One male slave, Germanic property of Marcus Crassus Aquila, assigned for gladiator training. The ink dried as the heat shimmered off marble walls. The boy he wouldn't be allowed a name until he earned one through blood was led to the branding corner. The iron glowed a violent orange. It bore the insignia of Achilles Lutus. The metal met skin with a hiss. Flesh burned. The smell joined the thick tapestry of the market air. He did not scream. Perhaps he knew. Silence was the first lesson. Shackles were clamped around his ankles, linked just tightly enough to prevent escape. They were smooth from generations of wear, legacy passed from limb to limb. He was led toward the gladiator school that would unmake and remake him. Behind, the market continued. Other bodies, other prices. The system never paused for individual tragedies. They called it training, but it was the elimination of choice. Sleeping cell no. 47. Straw bedding that reeked of other lives. The tunic clung to his fresh brand. Pain became the currency. Endurance became respect. The school spanned 3 acres outside Rome's walls, wrapped in 15-foot stone barriers. Inside, a brutal rhythm: weapons training, strength conditioning, injury treatment, punishment. The walls bore stains of blood, sweat, and time. Time that had watched boys become beasts. By dawn, the air cracked with wooden swords on shields, Latin, Greek curses in broken Germanic. Understanding wasn't required, obedience was. A gesture meant move, a nod meant strike. His meals were engineered: porridge for fuel, beans for muscle, oil for fat, and wine diluted with water. Enough to grow strong, not enough to grow thoughts. Hunger never quite gone. A man who fights for food, they'd learned, fights harder than one who fights for freedom. Hierarchy ruled the dormitory. Veterans wore leather bands. Newcomers bowed. The boy learned to defer, then to mimic, then to fight. His hands split and bled, hardened into stone. His shoulders expanded. His gladius no longer a weapon, but an extension of his body. 10,000 thrusts, 10,000 blocks, 10,000 steps. Training by the numbers, conditioning by necessity. Sleep came in ragged 4-hour intervals. Dreams blurred into fragments of a forgotten life: a mother's voice, the smell of pine, a sky without bars. Those faded. He stopped remembering. 3 months later, Ferox was born, no longer a boy. Not quite a man. Something else. Something useful. He was called Ferox, the Fierce One, a name earned during drills. He called Aquila father. He called other slaves brothers. Language of blood replaced with language of ownership. Aquila walked the dining hall like a patriarch, offering praise like coins. A squeeze on the shoulder, a rare cup of unmixed wine, a nod meant the world. When praise didn't come, Ferox pushed harder, hungry for the warmth of approval. A reward was affection. Affection was control. Veterans like Brutus, a Gaul with 18 kills, offered mentorship, but guidance was currency, too. Affection and rivalry danced in a deadly embrace. Every smile was both comfort and calculation. Romance was encouraged between gladiators and the female slaves. Ferox found solace in Silva, a Germanic girl with eyes like frost. Their touches felt real. But their connection, like their meals, had been measured, planned, permitted. Festivals like Saturnalia flipped the order. Trainers served slaves, masters performed chores. It gave the illusion of freedom, so the return to chains would feel like a privilege. Suffering became story. Story became glory. Injuries were treated with surgical precision, not mercy, but investment. A gladiator healed was a gladiator that bled again for profit. Funerals were theatrical. Speeches, praise to honor. Martyrs were crowned. Even death was Moni TIZ6.FEROX, no longer imagined escape. His world was reduced to stone walls, iron routines, and approval rationed like wine. His soul conditioned to cheer his own captivity. The transformation was complete. The boy was gone, and in his place stood a weapon disguised as a man, ready to bleed for the empire that taught him how. If the structure was artificial, he loved his father who had purchased him, his brothers who competed with him as women who belonged to the same master. Love had become the strongest chain of all 6 months after his purchase. The boy who now answered to Ferox stood in the holding area beneath the Colosseum, feeling the crowd's hunger vibrate through stone walls 15 feet thick. His gladius, the same sword he'd practiced with 10,000 times against straw targets, felt different now that it would taste human blood instead of vegetable fiber. The Germanic girl Silva had braided a leather cord around his wrist that morning, a gesture of affection that felt like blessing and curse simultaneously. She belonged to the same master, lived in the same compound, existed within the same system that had manufactured their love as efficiently as it had manufactured his killing skills. The cord smelled of the olive oil she used to clean wounds in the infirmary. His opponent was a Thracian named Demetrius, 3 years older and seasoned by 5 previous arena appearances. They had shared meals at the gladiator school, practiced together in the courtyard, even laughed at the same crude jokes told by the veteran fighters. Now they faced each other across 20 feet of sand, armed with the tools of each other's destruction. The editor of the games, a politician seeking popular favor, raised his white cloth. The crowd fell silent with anticipation that was almost sexual in its intensity. Ferox could hear his own heartbeat, the whisper of sand beneath his feet, the leather creaking as Demetrius shifted his grip on his curved seeker. Time moved like honey in winter. The cloth dropped. Demetrius moved first, his curved blade seeking the gap between shield and armor at Ferox's side. Training took over. Ferox's shield deflected the strike while his gladius thrust toward the Thracian's exposed ribs. Steel rang against steel. The crowd released its held breath in a collective sigh of satisfaction. They circled each other under the afternoon sun, seeking advantage, testing defense, learning the rhythm of their partner's movements. This was not the wild flailing of desperate men, but the calculated dance of professionals who understood their craft. Each cut was placed with precision, each block timed to the heartbeat, each feint designed to create the opening that would end the performance. Demetrius stumbled, whether from fatigue or strategy. Pharaohs never knew. The Thracian shield dropped 6 inches, exposing the hollow of his throat for less than a second. Ferox's gladiator moved without conscious thought, sliding between collarbones, severing arteries, finding the space where life resided. Blood sprayed across the sand in arterial spurts that painted geometric patterns. Demetrius's eyes widened with surprise, rather than pain, as if he could not quite believe that this was the moment of transition from performer to sacrifice. He tried to speak, but only blood emerged from his mouth, carrying words that would never be completed. The crowd erupted in approval, so thunderous that Ferox felt it in his chest like a physical blow. They were on their feet, arms raised, voices unanimous in their appreciation of his skill. The sound was intoxicating, more powerful than wine, more addictive than the opium the gladiators sometimes used to manage pain. For the first time since his capture, Ferox felt the crowd's love wash over him like a warm tide. Demetrius collapsed into the sand that drank his blood with the indifference of earth-absorbing rain. His body twitched once, twice, then lay still. The Thracian who had taught Ferox how to sharpen his blade, who had shared his portion of meat during illness, who had spoken tenderly of his sister in distant Thrace, became meat cooling under the Roman sun. The editor gestured approval. Attendants dressed as Karen entered to retrieve the body, dragging it toward the gate of death, while the crowd's attention had already shifted to the next pairing. Demetrius became a memory before his blood had finished soaking into the sand. Ferox raised his bloody gladius toward the imperial box where the empress sat in purple silk. The gesture was automatic, learned through countless hours of training, but the emotion behind it was genuine. He felt gratitude toward the system that had given him this moment of transcendence, this taste of what it meant to be more than a slave. Walking back through the gate of life, still hearing the echoes of acclamation, Ferox understood that he had crossed a threshold more significant than the one between arena and holding area. He had become someone who could take a human life and feel elevated rather than diminished by the act. The crowd's approval had transformed murder into accomplishment, brutality into art. That night, as he cleaned his equipment in the gladiator school, Ferox realized he was looking forward to his next performance. 2 years after his first kill, 18 months after his 10th, vendors outside the Colosseum began selling oil lamps bearing Ferox's image. The ceramic showed him in the moment of triumph. Gladius raised foot planted on the chest of a defeated opponent whose face had been left deliberately vague so the lamp could commemorate any of his kills. Children throughout Rome played with wooden figurines carved in his likeness, reenacting battles that had left real men dead in sand that sparkled with powdered gold. The scars that now mapped his torso told stories that every citizen knew by heart. The puckered line across his ribs from the Thracian's desperate thrust in his 3rd match, the pale tissue on his shoulder where a German's axe had bitten deep in his 7th. Each mark was a chapter in a biography written in pain that had been transformed into entertainment. More valuable than the flesh that bore it, the transformation had been gradual but absolute. Each victory brought refinements to his public image that moved him further from the Germanic boy who'd been sold in the Forum. A professional artist painted his portrait on the wall of a popular tavern, adding scars he did not possess and muscles more heroic than Anatomy allowed poets composed verses celebrating his courage that bore no resemblance to the calculating brutality required for arena. Survival women of senatorial families sent gifts to his cell, silk garments, bottles of expensive perfume, poems, written in their own hands expressing admiration for his prowess. These offerings were displayed, publicly marking him as an object of desire for the empire's most elevated citizens. The irony that these same women would never acknowledge his existence outside the arena context was lost in the intoxication of their attention. Marcus Crassus Aquila discovered that Ferox's fame was more valuable than his fighting ability. Wealthy Romans paid premium prices to attend private exhibitions where demonstrated combat techniques against condemned criminals. These intimate performances allowed the elite to examine the celebrity gladiator up close, to touch the scars that marked his body, to feel vicarious contact with controlled danger. The crowd had learned his preferences and anticipated his signature moves when he entered the arena. 50 voices chanted his name in unison, a sound that seemed to lift him above the sand, above the stone walls, above his circumstances. In those moments, surrounded by adoration that felt like worship, it became impossible to remember that love and imprisonment were not mutually exclusive. His cell was relocated to a private section of the gladiator school, furnished with a real bed, decorated with the gifts from admirers, equipped with luxuries that elevated him above his fellow slaves. The comfort was genuine, but it also served to separate him from potential allies, to make him complicit in his own captivity through privilege that would be lost if he resisted the system. Younger gladiators sought his guidance with the reverence normally reserved for religious figures. They studied his techniques, imitated his mannerisms, competed for the smallest acknowledgement from the man whose success proved that elevation within the system was possible. Ferox found himself dispensing wisdom about combat survival and the management of crowd psychology, as if these skills were noble rather than necessary. Betting on his matches became so popular that odds makers hired mathematicians to calculate probability based on his opponent's fighting style, physical condition, and psychological state. Ferox's body became the foundation for a complex economic system that employed hundreds of people: bookmakers, odds calculators, information brokers who sold details about his training to interested gamblers. His death would collapse multiple businesses. The emperor himself requested a private audience, during which Ferox was praised for bringing honor to the empire through his skill and dedication. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but being acknowledged by the supreme authority of the known world created a sense of validation that ran deeper than reason. He had been seen, recognized, elevated to imperial attention. The slave who had been branded like livestock now basked in the approval of a god. Merchants throughout the empire used his image to sell products that had nothing to do with gladiatorial combat. Wine sellers claimed their vintage gave men the strength of Ferox. Weaponsmiths advertised blades forged in the style preferred by the great gladiator. Brothel owners named their most attractive slaves after him. His identity had been packaged and distributed as a commodity more valuable than his actual person. The fame that seemed like freedom was actually the most sophisticated form of captivity ever devised. Every cheer from the crowd was another link in chains made of adoration. Every gift from an admirer was another reason to remain grateful for his circumstances. Every poem written in his honor was another layer of false identity that buried the boy who had once possessed a different name in a different world. Ferox understood with the clarity that comes only in the dark hours before dawn that his celebrity had made escape impossible. He could not flee Rome because his face was carved in marble throughout the city. He could not blend into crowds because his scars told stories that every citizen knew by heart. He could not disappear because his absence would be noticed by thousands of people who believed they loved him. He was the most famous slave in the empire, and therefore the most perfectly imprisoned man who had ever lived. 6 years after the auctioneer had declared him sold 43 arena appearances after his first kill, the accumulated damage was reaching its mathematical conclusion. Ferox's left knee, shattered by a mace blow in his 28th match and never properly healed, sent lightning through his leg each time he pivoted. His sword arm, weakened by tendons, severed and restitched in his 35th victory, trembled with fatigue after prolonged combat. The crowd that had loved him since his spectacular debut against Demetrius the Thracian sensed weakness with the intuition of creatures bred for watching death. Their voices changed pitch, becoming higher, more urgent as 50 people leaned forward to observe the first signs that their entertainment was approaching its climax. The cut across his thigh was deeper than intended, but Cush, the Nubian gladiator who faced him, had learned to read weakness the way Ferox had once learned to read the spacing between shield and armor. The dark stains spread across white linen that had been wrapped around wounds from previous matches, souvenirs from men who had tried to kill him and failed until this moment when failure was no longer an option. Ferox had survived 43 arena appearances across 6 years. His body was a map of accumulated damaged bones that had been broken and reset, muscles that had been torn and restitched, scars that formed patterns as complex as military decorations. Each mark represented a moment when he had chosen survival over surrender, when he had pulled victory from the embrace of defeat. But the accumulation was reaching its mathematical conclusion. The editor of the games, a consul seeking to commemorate his son's coming of age, had paid extraordinary sums to ensure this match would be remembered. The sand had been mixed with powdered gold that caught the afternoon light. Musicians stationed around the arena provided orchestral accompaniment to the combat. Professional mourners waited in the wings to perform elaborate death songs. If the crowd's favorite fell, Kush struck again, his curved blade opening another line across Ferox's sword arm. Blood ran down the gladiator's handle, making his grip uncertain. The crowd's roar intensified, not with joy but with the complex emotion of spectators watching their investment face destruction. They loved him, but they loved the drama of his potential death more. The wound was not fatal, but it was decisive. Ferox's attacks became defensive. His footwork, once precise as a dancer's, grew clumsy. The gladius that had been an extension of his will became a burden. He could barely lift. Kush pressed his advantage with professional courtesy, delivering cuts designed to weaken rather than kill, extending the performance until the audience reached peak engagement. When Ferox finally fell, it was with the grace that 6 years of training had instilled. He rolled to absorb the impact, kept his shield raised even as his knee touched sand, maintained the dignity that his admirers expected even in defeat. The crowd fell silent, not the expectant quiet before climax, but the reverent hush that accompanies sacred moments. Kush stood above him, blade raised, waiting for the signal that would determine whether mercy or death would conclude the performance. The editor rose from his seat, consulting the crowd's will through gestures that had been refined across centuries of such moments. Thumbs were extended, some up, some down, creating a visual democracy of death. The calculation was complex. Ferox's fame made him valuable alive, but his accumulated injuries suggested his useful life was ending. His defeat this day had been decisive enough to satisfy honor, but close enough to maintain dignity. The crowd's bloodlust was aroused but not yet satisfied. The mathematics of entertainment demanded resolution. The editor's thumb turned downward. Kush's blade found the gap between neck and shoulder with the precision of a surgeon. The cut was clean, deep, designed to end consciousness before pain could register. Ferox's blood poured into sand that had absorbed the life of 10 men before him, each death as carefully orchestrated as his own. The crowd erupted in appreciation that was simultaneously mourning and celebration. They had witnessed artistry, the perfect conclusion to a career that had provided years of reliable entertainment. Musicians began the death songs that transformed brutality into beauty, that gave meaning to meaninglessness, that made murder feel like sacrifice. Attendants dressed as Mercury entered to verify the completeness of death, prodding the body with heated iron rods to ensure no deception. Others, costumed as Karen, prepared to ferry the corpse to whatever processing awaited beyond the gate of death. The theatrical elements continued even after consciousness had ended. The body that had been Ferox was dragged across sand that sparkled with gold dust, leaving a dark trail that caught the light like a comet's tail. The crowd watched until the gate closed, then turned their attention to the next pairing, the next possibility for transcendent violence, the next opportunity to witness transformation through death. In the holding areas beneath the arena, gladiators who had known Ferox cleaned their weapons and prepared for their own performances. His death was a reminder of their destination, but also proof that fame, skill, and crowd approval could sustain a man for years. Before the mathematics of mortality claimed their due, the show continued without pause. The machine required fresh performances, new heroes, different endings to the same eternal story. Ferox had played his role with professional excellence, but the system had outlived him and would outlive all his successors. His death had been perfect entertainment. The body that had cost Marcus Crassus 120 denarii 6 years earlier was processed with efficiency that would have impressed military quartermasters. The boy who had once possessed a different name in a different world had become 180 pounds of valuable commodity in an empire that wasted nothing, especially nothing that had drawn crowds and generated revenue during life. The blood that had carried his consciousness for 22 years was collected in bronze vessels. While still warm from arterial flow, Silver, the Germanic girl who had braided leather cords around his wrists before every match, was assigned to wash the vessels clean after physicians had sold the contents to epileptics who believed consuming gladiator vitality could cure their affliction. Her tears mixed with water that ran red down the drainage channels, but the system had no mechanism for processing grief. The blood, still warm from arterial flow, was collected in bronze vessels and sold to epileptics who believed consuming gladiator vitality could cure their affliction. Physicians recommended the treatment with straight faces, prescribing doses measured to the dram, charging fees that reflected the perceived potency of blood spilled in heroic circumstances. The liquid that had carried Ferox's consciousness became medicine for strangers who never learned his name. His flesh was butchered by professionals who understood anatomy as precisely as any surgeon. Certain cuts were reserved for ritual consumption. Senators paid premium prices for gladiator steaks served at dinner parties, believing the meat carried courage that could be absorbed through digestion. The muscle that had wielded sword and shield became delicacy for palates sophisticated enough to taste bravery. The bones were processed through mills that reduced them to powder fine as flour. Apothecaries mixed gladiator bone meal with honey to create ointments. supposedly capable of healing wounds, restoring virility, extending life. The calcium that had supported 6 years of arena combat was transformed into folk remedies sold in amphorae, marked with symbols that promised strength and endurance. His skin was treated with chemicals that preserved its scars, then sold to collectors who displayed strips of gladiator hide like trophies. The largest section bearing the wound that had killed him was purchased by a wealthy merchant, who mounted it in his atrium beside other curiosities from the empire's far reaches. Visitors could touch the scar tissue and claim connection to legendary courage. The gladiator school held a funeral ceremony that transformed Ferox's death into inspiration for surviving fighters. Marcus Crassus Aquila delivered a eulogy that praised dedication, skill, and honor while carefully avoiding any suggestion that the system itself bore responsibility for the loss. The speech became template for future memorials, refined through repetition until every gladiator's death could be framed as noble sacrifice. Within months, street performers throughout Rome were reenacting Ferox's famous battles with theatrical flair that bore no resemblance to the calculated brutality of actual combat. Children played games where they competed to portray the hero, arguing over who could most accurately imitate his signature moves. The performances grew more elaborate with each telling, adding elements of magic and divine intervention that elevated human suffering to mythological status. Poets composed epic verses that placed Ferox among legendary heroes who had never existed. His Germanic origins were romanticized into noble lineage. His slavery was reframed as voluntary service to Roman glory. His deaths of other gladiators became merciful releases granted to unworthy opponents. The boy who had been weighed like grain became demigod through literary revision. Artists carved his image into public monuments, but the face they sculpted bore no resemblance to the actual features that had been destroyed by years of combat. The marble Ferox was idealized, perfected, transformed into symbol rather than memorial. Citizens who had cheered his death walked past statues that commemorated a person who had never existed, honoring fiction while forgetting fact. The gladiator school's official records were edited to enhance legend. Scribes added victories that had never occurred, described techniques that defied physics, attributed wisdom that reflected literary imagination rather than battlefield experience. Future historians would write about Ferox based on these falsified documents, ensuring that even scholarly accounts would perpetuate the mythology. His former cell was converted into a shrine where visitors could purchase blessed oils, protective amulets, and miniature weapons supposedly modeled after his personal equipment. The space where he had struggled with doubt, pain, and the gradual erosion of identity became tourist attraction that generated revenue for the school that had orchestrated his destruction. Decades later, when new generations of gladiators rose to prominence, their achievements were measured against Ferox's manufactured legacy. They competed not just with living opponents but with ghostly standards that had been inflated beyond human possibility. The myth became heavier burden than the reality had ever been. The most profound transformation was the gradual erasure of the system's responsibility for his death. Cultural memory preserved his courage, while forgetting his captivity, celebrated his skill while ignoring his slavery, honored his legend. While erasing the machinery that had consumed his life, he became an example of Roman virtues rather than victim of Roman cruelty. The boy who had been purchased for 120 denarii, who had learned to kill for crowd approval, who had discovered that fame was the most sophisticated form of imprisonment, disappeared entirely. In his place stood a legend that served the system more effectively than the living man ever had. Even in death, he remained property of the empire that had consumed him. 3 days after the boy from Germany had bled out in sand mixed with powdered gold, slave traders returned to the forum with new inventory. The profit from Ferox's career ticket, sales, betting percentages, merchandising rights, and the final auction of his body parts had funded the purchase of 12 new slaves at prices that reflected inflation and the gladiator market. Each boy would undergo the same conditioning protocols that had transformed Germanic farmer's son into Roman entertainer, the same psychological techniques that had manufactured loyalty from captivity, the same systematic elimination of choice that had proven reliable across decades of operation. Marcus Crassus Aquilus walked among the offerings with practiced eyes, seeking the physical attributes that had made his previous investment profitable. Broad the shoulders, dense bone structure, the kind of reflexes that suggested survival potential. Age: young enough for extended training, old enough for immediate utility. The criteria had not changed because human anatomy remained constant across generations. The bidding patterns followed familiar rhythms. Other Lanistae recognized the same qualities. Aquilus valued driving prices upward through competition that benefited sellers, while treating buyers as economic units. A Gallic boy who resembled the young Ferox sold for 130 denarii, inflation adjusted for the dead gladiator's proven model. The market had learned from its successes at the gladiator school. New arrivals underwent the same conditioning protocols that had transformed the Germanic slave into arena performer. Physical training designed to build specific muscle groups, nutritional regimens calculated to optimize performance, psychological techniques refined through decades of converting humans into entertainers willing to die for crowd approval. The methods required no modification because they had demonstrated reliable effectiveness. The hierarchy among gladiators absorbed newcomers. Through established mechanisms, veterans who had learned brutality from ferox now taught those same lessons to fresh slaves, passing down techniques for survival and strategies for earning approval. Cruelty distributed itself through the ranks, automatically requiring no oversight from Roman trainers who could focus on other aspects of the operation. In the arena, crowds welcomed new performers with the same enthusiasm they had once reserved for ferox. The entertainment value did not depend on individual personalities, but on the systematic production of combat skills. Dramatic tension and carefully orchestrated death names. Changed faces varied, but the core product remained consistent across seasons and years. Children throughout the empire continued playing gladiator games, but their reenactments now featured current fighters rather than the legendary pharaohs. Cultural memory proved shorter than the system's capacity for self-renewal. New heroes emerged to capture imagination, previously devoted to the dead champion, ensuring continued public investment in arena entertainment without requiring mourning periods that might dampen enthusiasm. The economic infrastructure that had supported ferox's career adapted seamlessly to new stars. Betting systems transferred algorithms from analyzing his fighting style to predicting outcomes for his successors. Merchants replaced his image on their products with fresher faces that represented current rather than historical violence. The machinery of commodified brutality continued operating without interruption. Roman senators' daughters sent gifts to new gladiator cells, expressing the same admiration for masculine violence that had elevated ferox to celebrity status. The letters contained identical phrases, identical fantasies, identical mechanisms for transforming murderers into objects of aristocratic desire. Romance, like everything else in the system, followed reproducible patterns. Provincial cities built arenas modeled after the Colosseum, each requiring its own supply of gladiators trained according to Roman methods. The system expanded geographically while maintaining consistency of function, spreading the infrastructure of a normalized cruelty throughout territories where local populations learned to cheer for choreographed death. Empire meant exporting not just laws and language but entertainment. Built on human sacrifice, military campaigns continued producing the raw material, captives who could be processed into gladiators through techniques perfected on countless previous subjects. Wars served multiple purposes, but one consistent function was feeding the arena system with fresh bodies that could be transformed into performers. Conquest and entertainment formed a symbiotic relationship that justified expansion through popular demand for new spectacles. The emperor who had praised ferox died of natural causes, replaced by successors who maintained identical policies. Regarding gladiatorial games, political leadership changed, but institutional commitment to arena entertainment remained constant across dynasties, embedded too deeply in Roman culture to be affected by mere changes in personnel. The system had achieved independence from individual decision-makers. Decades passed, centuries passed. The Roman Empire itself eventually collapsed, but by then the concept of organized violence as mass entertainment had spread throughout human civilization. Different cultures developed variations on the theme, but the core principle, transforming human suffering into popular spectacle, proved remarkably durable across time. Geography and political systems. Modern societies created their own versions of the arena, adapting ancient techniques to contemporary technologies while preserving the essential function. The systematic conversion of individual tragedy into collective entertainment. The machinery evolved, but its appetite remained constant. The boy who had been sold for 120 denarii was forgotten, but the system that had consumed him continued operating under different names in different languages, serving audiences who believed themselves more civilized than Romans while participating in identical transactions. The machine required flesh, and flesh was always available for the right price. Cruelty had become ordinary, not through chaos but through structure that outlived all its participants. Thanks for watching.